One side of my family is French, so growing up, we would go to France during the summer to visit that part of the family. They lived in a small rural part of France near the German border. There were numerous abandoned bunkers and military bases from the two world wars. They always fascinated me in an exciting but creepy way. The well-known bunkers and bases, for the most part, were sealed up for safety issues. For example, the town was so small, they only had one baker growing up, and the baker's daughter went in one on her own and never came home. Turns out, these old structures have holes filled with water and a bunch of other dangerous death traps, in essence. She was found deep in one of these bunkers, drowned in the bottom of one of these holes. If you were to go too deep in one of these, get lost, or your flashlight dies, in essence, you are doomed. The thought of being a child dying in a pitch-dark hole in a bunker like that terrified me, but also intrigued me in a weird way to go look for these places. Horses and other wildlife would also run into these places and die. There were stories of deep recesses of these bunkers potentially still having toxic gases from the war or just from natural processes. Long story short, this is why they would seal these locations up. Anyways, some of the less known bunkers never were sealed up. My grandfather, who had lived in the village his entire life and had spent time in one particular bunker, had passed down its location over the years. In a roundabout way, my cousins and I heard of its location and went to look. My parents never wanted us near these for obvious reasons. But kids being kids, we would go looking for them. Pretty far back in the woods, after hiking an hour or so, we start finding some old structures. One structure was odd because it was still mostly intact and you could tell someone was actively using it despite how remote it was. Inside were a ton of porno mags and other weird things. Just kind of weird all around due to the fact that's not something you expect to see in such a remote area. Anyways, we are about to turn around because we can't find the bunker. We continue a bit, and there it is. A large, black, overgrown hole in the side of this hill in the middle of the forest. Keep in mind, we are kids, probably about 13, 14 years old. So your imagination is going wild. It's a weird sensation because you know logically, 95% chance nothing malicious is in this pitch black underground structure, but at the same time, you know there's some weirdo with pornos stashed nearby, and we also know the stories of people dying and going missing in these locations. On top of that, the location we were at was not well known at all, so we were basically on our own. We end up grabbing some large sticks in our minds that would save us from attackers, and we begin slowly approaching the opening. We end up going in little by little with a few flashlights, slowly and carefully looking through old abandoned rooms. As a kid who was into World War II, my imagination kept thinking I was going to find Nazi relics or something else. It was also crazy to imagine the people who fought and lived in these subterranean structures. It's creepy how dark and silent these bunkers are. It's so quiet, every noise you make seems very loud, and you sense you are going to alert whatever is waiting for you further back in the dark. The dark plays tricks on your mind. You constantly feel like you are in a state of alert. It's hard to describe the sensation in words. The smell and cold air of these places, I can still remember. We get a decent way in, and at this point, the only light we have are the ones we brought. We are getting a bit uneasy as we get farther in. We start entering these large rooms that break down into a maze of other rooms. we start seeing signs that people have recently been there. But then again, these places are time capsules, so something can look like it's been there recently, when in reality, it could have been there since the 1980s. We get into one room where we see Nazi graffiti, as in swastikas, SS bolts, not from World War II, but more recent. There were also short paragraphs of writing on some walls with weird stories about units from the war who had died there and to leave, etc. Just weird, creepy crap all around. The writings increased and seemed pseudo-schizophrenic in nature, so it put us all on edge. By this point, we had been in there for a while and were starting to feel uncomfortable. These large chambers have doors in them that led into unknown, dark labyrinths that go deeper into the bunker. The layout of this bunker seemed to be basically a main vein or corridor with offshoots into chambers that at times would also have offshoots that go further back. We saw at one point some stairs that descended, and it seemed like there was water at the bottom, but we couldn't see. We knew there was water because we threw some rocks down. As we are leaving and heading towards the main vein or corridor of the bunker, we hear noises coming from one of the offshoot chambers, coming from somewhere deep in the bunker. We all stop and listen. It's hard to understand how far the noise was from us, since sound travels in crazy ways in these structures. We call out to see if anyone was there, but the noise stops, and we are all just standing in silence, only able to see a few feet ahead of us. The noise seemed too loud to be an animal, plus most animals wouldn't be this far back in a bunker. It honestly sounded like someone trying to be quiet who accidentally knocked something over and made a ton of noise. At this point, after what we had already seen, we decide it's time to head back towards the exit. As we quickly start heading out, nobody wanted to be the last person in line. There was just a general sense of unease, darkness, and a sense we were being watched or followed. We found our way out pretty quickly and got back to the village as quickly as we could. All in all, it was an exciting, yet creepy adventure. Urban exploring at its finest for some young teens. In a weird way, it's like the bunker in your curiosity beckons you to go deeper and deeper into the darkness and the silence. But at the same time, your conscience seems to be telling you it's time to get the F out. You want to explore as deep as possible in the hopes of finding something or seeing something. In reality, everyone tells you to stay away and that there is nothing to see. But it sure does pique a teenager's curiosity. I'm not much older, and my grandparents from the village passed away due to COVID and natural causes. We are going back to the village this summer to settle their affairs and to say goodbye to the village my family grew up in. However, my cousins and I are planning on going back to a few of the bunkers we found to take a deeper look into what they may hold. When I was young, I went to an elementary school that was situated with a large field at the back. This was where the track was, the baseball diamond, etc. And that field was surrounded on 3 sides by a chain link fence with a forest area beyond it. This wasn't a big area either. It took maybe 5 minutes walking straight back to reach my friend's house and the neighborhood behind the forest. The interesting thing about this wooded area was that the fence had 2 exits built into it. One in the far back left corner, which led to a trail straight to that neighborhood, and one in the middle of the right-hand fence, which led nowhere. In fact, the entire right third of the forest is inaccessible due to the massive invasive blackberry bushes that fill it. Now, I live in a small town, Not small as in population. My high school had over 2,000 students, and it was one of four in the area, but literally physically small. The main commercial area of the town is small and cramped, and right next to the school, and the freeway cuts right through town. So when you're at the school, you hear cars, always. This will be relevant, I promise. So one day after my friend and I were well into middle school, we decided to go hang out at the elementary school on a Saturday, just vibe on the playground and stuff. And I bring up the weird exit on the right-hand side of the field, and we decide to check it out because we had never been in there. And that summer, there were pretty suspicious goings-on in the woods as a whole that we were trying to keep an eye on. There was a literal gang trying to set up shop, but that's another story. One more bit of context: the fence. From the field, when you look at the right-hand side of the fence near the gate, you can't see anything inside. All the plants are pressed so close to the fence that leaves are sticking through. So we walk in, and everything is wrong. For one thing, it goes dead silent. No birds, no wind, and no cars. We just took 5 steps closer to the main road, and there's no car noises. I'd call that a big red flag if I've ever seen one. Next, we notice that the ground is bare. Unlike the other areas, there's no undergrowth in this section of forest, which is very weird, considering we just saw how thick the underbrush was on the other side of the fence. So I turn and look, and there's no young trees, no ferns, and no blackberry brambles. The entire fence line for a good 30-foot span is completely clear. You can see right down to the track where my friends and I would walk every recess. If you crouch, you could see the whole field. Now you're free not to believe me, but I fully believe that I'm very sensitive to the supernatural. And my get the F out alarm was going off like mad. But I decided to turn around and give the place a good look anyway. So I scan right to left, and everything looks pretty normal until I hit the left side of my vision, and parallel to the fence are a series of archways. Young trees, stripped of their branches and bent over to form half circles, easily 10 of them, if not more, each one getting steadily smaller than the rest. Unnaturally perfect, clearly intentional. And there was a single lone footprint, bigger than either of ours, in the muddy dirt in the middle of the arches. We left sincere tracks in the mud walking in there. There's no way a single shoe print should be on its own. And it had rained the night before, which meant whatever did that had to be there in the past 10 or so hours. I'm not an idiot, so I grabbed my friend and we ran out of there. And yes, we double-checked, and from the outside of the fence, you hear cars, you hear birds, and you see all sorts of branches and leaves poking through the fence. We never went back there, and that area of forest got mowed down for a hospital a couple years ago. So I guess I'll never know what I walked into. About 20 years ago, my wife and our 2 children, twins, they were about 1 year old at the time, moved into a house that sat right at the edge of about 40 acres of heavily wooded land in Kentucky. We had a dog. He was a good dog and a great security system. We named him Zeus. This dog was a tank. He was a stray, a mutt of some kind, and I don't know what breeds he was made up of, but he was huge. My neighbor told me once that he saw Zeus get hit by a car on the nearby highway, and Zeus just walked away like nothing happened. Not a scratch on him. Anyway, Zeus stayed outside most of the time, and while he wasn't much of a barker, On some nights, he would occasionally bark at the local nocturnal wildlife in the nearby woods. One night, however, Zeus started barking incessantly, probably around 11 p.m. I tried to ignore it for a while, hoping he would stop, but he just would not stop barking. He had a very loud bark, and I was afraid he would wake the kids, so I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to see what was going on. I found him out back at the edge of our small vegetable garden, barking at the woods. I could tell he was on edge, and he barely acknowledged my presence when I stood beside him. He just kept barking. I pointed the beam of my flashlight at the tree line, expecting to see the eyes of a raccoon or a possum or maybe a rabid coyote. Healthy coyotes usually stayed well away from the area, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I gave old Zeus a good pat and a scratch, and this seemed to soothe him for a moment, but as soon as I stopped petting him, he immediately started barking at the trees again. I realized the only way to calm him down would be to take him into the woods so he could examine whatever it was that was freaking him out. I walked to the head of a nearby trail that cut into the woods, and Zeus followed. He seemed happy to be going. He and I had walked that trail many times, and he usually stayed right by my side. But on that night, he had only made it 100 meters or so into the woods when Zeus bolted into the trees to the left side of the trail. I called for him, but he ignored me. I could hear him making his way quickly through the thick underbrush, moving away from me. I called for him until he had moved so far away that I couldn't hear him anymore. Crap, I thought. I'm going to have to go in after him. Bushwhacking in the middle of the night sounded like an awful idea, so I continued down the trail looking for a break in the underbrush where I could pick my way through in the dog's direction. A couple of minutes later, I stopped walking when I heard something crashing through the woods, coming towards me. The sound seemed to be coming from the general area where I thought Zeus would have been, and it sounded like him, so I assumed he had finished his investigation and was coming back to me. The source of the sound grew closer and closer until it was near enough for me to predict where Zeus would reach the trail, which was a spot about 15 feet ahead of me. I focused my light there, but something else came out of the woods instead. It came out right where I thought it would, and my flashlight afforded me a good look at it. But it's difficult for me to explain what it looked like. It was just a thing. If I had to describe its color, well, I suppose I would say it was gray, but that's not exactly right. I had estimated it was less than 3 feet in length, but I could see no head, no legs, no tail, no appendages of any kind. Just a kind of amorphous, grayish, seemingly opaque thing. The thing moved across the trail in front of me from left to right, but it never touched the ground. It was just kind of gliding through the air at about waist high. Whatever it was disappeared into the woods on the right side of the trail, and a moment later, Zeus burst onto the path from my left, and he followed it. I realized then that the crashing sound I had been hearing seconds before had been the dog, and that the gray thing hadn't been making any sound at all as it moved. Zeus seemed to lose track of the thing soon after he crossed the path, and he came back to me. Afterward, he and I went back home, and we never spoke of the incident again. This was something I really had a hard time coming to grips with that happened when I was 13 years old. Back when I lived in Houston, Texas, I lived in the suburbs. It was a nice, bustling area, and I was always around people, whether in the apartment complex I was in or just going about my day. I was never truly alone. I had a good friend I still frequently talk to. Let's call her Sarah. Her grandmother lived in Louisiana. I had never been one for long road trips, but I thought having a nice girls' weekend with her would be fun, and I would bite the bullet and try enjoy myself for this car ride with her parents, me, and her in a stinky old minivan. Her grandma wasn't the nicest, but she liked me well enough, I think. We were out in the middle of the woods. She was extremely close to the Kisatchie National Forest, so the homes were spread far apart and the woods were vast. The middle of nowhere. Her grandma had a thing for people being too close to her, so my friend and I were out in the woods, playing and exploring these dense woods behind her property. There was a nice creek, and the trees seemed to muffle the outside world. There were birds chirping, and we saw lots of wildlife, lizards, squirrels, chipmunks. This forest was crawling with life. It was amazing. We must have been out there for at least 2 hours, because as the sun started setting, we started to get antsy to return back. Now, her grandma had a huge property. She enjoyed her space, and you must understand, there was no houses or neighbors beside her. She basically spent a fortune on her space. So anyways, we start back and follow the winding creek back up to her house since it was vertical to her place. There's a noise behind us. It sounded like a dog or a wolf. I stopped, and my friend did too, and we listened. The noise continued. There's nothing more terrifying than absolute silence and actually hearing something behind you, following you. We were a ways away, but we were both frozen in fear. I was expecting it was a coyote or some wild dog, but as the footsteps from the dark grew closer, I heard a ragged breath that sounded less dog and more almost human. It started off quiet, but it grew louder and almost ravenous as it got closer. I slowly turned around as my vision adjusted to the dark. Now it sounded like something was dragging its legs through the leaves. Then it stopped. There was more silence. Nothing. No sounds. No panting. Nothing. We were both petrified. We were scared now to move an inch, because whatever it was that was with us was so close, it would surely outrun and outtake us. Then we both heard the most bizarre sound in our lives. It was a deep, long moan, but it took us both by surprise. I managed to take a quick look at whatever it was. The sound was coming from a tree a couple feet from my friend, and I saw it. One hand was gripping the tree, and through the dusk, I could see paper pale skin and the eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were wide, and the mouth was gaping like a dead fish. I didn't have time to analyze if it was a woman or a man, demon, whatever it was. I just wanted to get out of the woods. The sound stopped as I locked eyes. I felt my heart stop. My friend managed to tear herself out of her trance we were both in and grabbed my arm, and we booked it. We both started screaming and yelling to hopefully scare whatever was after us off. Neither of us heard any noise behind us since we were so pumped on adrenaline, running and screaming, running and screaming. We didn't stop till we slammed the back door and locked it. Not 10 minutes after we got back, I demanded to go back home, and my friend was just as shaken up since both of us refused to stay in that house. So we got a hotel at a nice nearby place, and I left the next day. I tried to be in a good mood the rest of the time I was there, and honestly, it was a great trip, other than that walk in the woods. Her grandmother actually passed away 2 days after we left. Being alone on a crazy big property like she was on, I was surprised a neighbor a couple miles from her came to check on her. We were not sure how she passed, but my friend and I have our suspicions, and still do. My family has a cabin in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains. There's this one particular hike nearby that we would always go on when I was growing up that took you up a large hill, cut down into a ravine, and took you down to an abandoned mining cabin. It was really cool, and the cabin was full of old antiques, books, cans, furniture, etc. So last summer I took my significant other on the hike to show off this cool abandoned cabin. It had been about 5 years since I'd been on this hike, and it took us a while to find the trailhead because it was so overgrown. We hacked our way through brush, and luckily I had a really good memory for the general direction we should be going. As we were heading down the ravine, we finally saw the roof of the old cabin. Excited that we had found our way through all the brush, we headed towards it. But when we went inside, it was completely different than the last time I'd been there. Instead of cool old furniture and antiques, there was a nest. This nest stretched from the floor to the ceiling and across 2 entire walls of the cabin. But the most unsettling thing about it is the nest was made of bones. Not small bones either. They were huge bones. One was the size of a human clavicle, and others were bigger. I immediately had this terrible feeling and wanted to get the hell out as soon as possible. Well, we booked it out of there and ran up the ravine as quickly as our dog could keep up. We reached the top in less than 30 minutes and were at the top of the hill where we could look down and see our own cabin below. We stopped to catch our breath at the top, which is fairly flat and has a lot of visibility. I decided to use that moment to try to get a signal on our phone from the high point. I got a hold of my mom and we were having a quick chat, but I kept hearing a strange noise. It was off in the distance though, so I couldn't make it out. But my significant other was hearing it too and getting increasingly uncomfortable. I could finally make out the noise, but realized that was because the noise was getting louder and closer. It was the sound of 2 metal objects being clanked together, like a spoon banging against a skillet. Then my dog gets super defensive and starts snarling and barking in the direction of where we just hiked out of. So now we are completely freaked out. I hang up the call, we grab our packs, and run the rest of the 2 miles back to our cabin. We reported our experience and gave our photos of the cabin interior to the local Forest Service, who concluded that the nest was most likely a bear or cougar den. But that noise we heard following us out of the ravine will haunt my nightmares for years to come.